One of my earliest fears in school, when I had decided that I wanted to be an artist. I always knew I wanted to be an artist, but until I discovered that it was voice, it really propelled me to pursue. But the fear in school is that I needed to make work that people would find recognizable as my own. But the deeper I got into the practice, the more it would just meander like a conversation, right? It kind of branches off and then you kind of follow that branch. I thought I'd show just a few works, but just kind of lead you down the thought process. So I just imagine it as a stream of thought. And so I use a lot of different materials, but I love ephemera and these objects that actually hold the history. And just thinking about Earth absorbing history, but also these objects that people have touched that have been passed on from hand to hand, absorbing the oils of our hands. So we become physically a part of it, which has really inspired me to do a lot more interactive work. This here is an image. These are documents. My father-in-law, let me back up a little bit. My family escaped the war in Vietnam in 1975. They came through 3 refugee camps. The first was in Subic Bay, Philippines, and the second one was in Guam, and then the third was in Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, where there was a family that sponsored them, and that's where I was born, just not in the refugee camp in Harrisburg after they had settled. My husband's family is from Vietnam and Cambodia. He was born in Vietnam and escaped as a child, as a baby, from Vietnam through Cambodia into Thailand on foot. And I don't know how people do that already. But it's the perseverance of the human spirit and the will to live and to live in hope in such a devastating world is what really inspires me. So here's an image of his father's release papers from the re-education camp, the labor camp. He was a high-ranking official in the South Vietnamese army, and because he worked with the government, they had an opportunity to flee, but he saw his people suffering so greatly that he just could not leave, and he ended up staying and fighting with his countrymen. And so when the communists took over, they imprisoned him, and he was actually released the day before his scheduled execution. And we had these papers since 2011 or 2001, and I knew that there was something that I needed to do with them, just didn't know what. And 15 years later, I decided, let's just print the image. Here's a monumental image. It's 4 by 5 feet. The original is maybe 4 by 5 inches. And it hung in the studio for months before I could figure out what to do, because I just didn't know how to honor him in the way that he deserved. So during the war, he was shot 17 times and survived. And so I took holy water, and I would just look up at him as I'm working and just cry for him. So I started saving my tears, because we're artists and we save everything. And I started rubbing the tears and the holy water into the watercolor paper until these war wounds could be reopened. Just to honor his will to live. And one of the earliest lessons that he had taught Hien, my husband, who is the youngest son, he had told him, because Hien grew up in a very rough area in the Central Valley of California, in Bakersfield, and he had told Hien as a young child, he was like 7 or 8 years old, just remember that it is very difficult to kill somebody who has a strong will to live. And as a child to be taught that lesson. So I included scripture here in one of the war wounds, and it reads, "Blessed is the man who endures." And I just think about all the ones who have attempted to escape violence and tyranny, and the multiple times that they escape having been brought back. And it is just astounding to me. Here's a close-up of one of the war wounds. I thought about the suffering that we go through and the hardship, and although it's something that we would never wish for, these wounds really create this fertile ground for growth. So I thought, it might be interesting to introduce actual growth. So I built this little planter that hangs right up behind the photo. Here's the image. So this piece was finished in 2017, and this is at the Triton Museum in Santa Clara. I had requested this box just to kind of hold these stones. Hien and I collect things, and we had gone to Refugee State Beach, and I started stacking these stones, these Pacific Ocean sea stones, just thinking about these stones are so much like us, right? Like the ones that we choose, whatever beauty we find in them, and the ones that I like are the smooth ones that have like a lot of weight to them, and they're just so beautiful and smooth, and just thinking about what a stone must go through to become this beautiful, refined object, which is who we are. Like they're smashed up against rocks, and they like tumble down cliffs, and they rub up against each other, and then they bang up against each other and roll onto the shore, and they go through like all this turmoil to become something beautiful and to be refined. And so I really love that idea, because I just refuse to think that like, I must believe to the extent that I know that no suffering is in vain. So I'm trying to seek hope, and art is the way that it's allowed me to do that and live it out, not just like hope for it or imagine it, but like really live it out in the daily practice and in the art practice. So I was setting up the stones on the shore, and they were lined up just like this, and I looked at it and was shocked. I was like, that's vertebrae. That looks like a spine. There's something there, not sure what. So of course, like we fill our backpacks, and my poor husband, he was like, this pile? And I was like, and that one, and that one, and that one, and that one. So there's 33 stones to represent the 33 vertebrae, and I wrapped each one with a lifeline. And I think about bloodline and lifeline in that red thread. And so it just kind of runs through. When Bakbun was imprisoned, they had him in a cell that was lower than his height, so he couldn't ever stand straight up, and because of that, he ruptured two of his discs, two of his vertebrae, and they had to remove two of the discs. So the first one and the last one do not have a lifeline that run through it. So when I was preparing for the show, I asked for a pedestal or a box to rest it in, and I had not even realized that it was part of the installation. I just saw it as a separate piece until we came into that space, and then I realized that it was a casket. It looks like a casket, and we were like laying him to rest. So these are the moments that I just cherish. I work so that I can discover things, and it's not from my own wisdom, or I'm patient, and and it just kind of reveals itself to me, and I listen. So the way that the patience in the work really, there's something miraculous that happens when I actually wait. When I try to rush things, I think some of most of us have probably experienced it. We try to rush things and something doesn't quite feel right, but we're trying to force the thing because of deadlines or whatever. Just being impatient. Thank you. And so there's a stone. I don't know if you could see the little black, where's that cursor? This little black right here. So I had, when Hien's father was in Vietnam, he actually served as a governor. And when they arrived in America, he worked in the oil fields and in the farms with other migrant families. And my first love is oil on canvas. So I was like, babe, we should go to the refinery. I need some of that oil. He was like, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. They're not going to just let you walk and collect oil. And I was like, oh, that's such a good idea, though. We should think about that. So I kind of kept it behind in my mind. And so as we're collecting these stones, there's like this black oil everywhere, just crude oil. And there was a spill and it had just kind of washed ashore, and that was my oil. Yes. Wow. So of course it just became a part of the work. And I just feel like these gifts are offered so often to me so that I can tell a story and just thinking about object as the thing that reminds us of the story. And it depends on us to tell it. Here's more natural material, more stones, more piles of stones. This is my husband, life-size portrait. And I often draw or paint my paint figures barely clothed. There's something about being barefoot and barely clothed that's very vulnerable. And here he is, with kind of balancing on this very uneven, precarious ground. This was during the height of immigration. So the reason why we were able to acquire Hien's father's paperwork was because Hien had served time in prison. So we had met at 20 at San Jose State, and there was an incident, and he was wrongfully convicted. And we spent the first 7.5 years of our marriage apart, and I just could not understand this injustice. Like, we were so naive. We're like, oh, we're innocent. It's fine. You're playing football. You're like all-American scholar athlete. There's no way. And that was our first insight into what the system was as young people. And so fast forward 2017, 18, 19, 20, there was like, the crisis was unbearable. Asian American families were being detained unlawfully, covertly, and because they had stripped away his citizenship. He's also married to a citizen. That doesn't matter. Law is not necessarily what we believe is law. It's what they determine law to be at the time. So this was a prayer for us, for our family, and for families that were going through the same thing. And so it was inspired by Psalm 91 that reads, "Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day." And then it continues in verse 7, 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. And I just had to make this visual prayer for the people and for us. And so here are these arrows that are just missing him, just very close calls. And there's these birds that I love painting. They represent migration and freedom and liberation. And so there's an American goldfinch there just perched on his head as a prayer for wisdom as we're navigating through this legal process. There's a silver-breasted broadbill that's native of Cambodia. And here's a Vietnamese greenfinch that's perched on his arm. And just as a reminder that we must move in grace and in patience and in wisdom. There's a lot to be angry about and we want to react, but it is just not always wise to react immediately. And so I fletched these arrows using indigenous methods. And this was like such a beautiful lesson in patience because I had to find, I like making things hard for myself. So I had to wait for 2 matching feathers of the same bird to make one arrow. And another lesson was like, prayer is real, it works. Because there was a moment where deadline was coming and I was like, oh my gosh, I just need an owl feather. I need like one more owl feather. And we spent 2 weeks hiking and at the beach, and I could not find just one feather of anything. And I'm like, of course, because I'm looking for it. And so we're driving back, and I'm just so disappointed. I say weird prayers. So I was like, can you just like buzz me with an owl feather? Like, weirdest prayer. And and we're driving, and within moments, he spots a great horned owl on the side of the road. And we pull over, and its body is still warm. It was a juvenile. It had a little bit of blood. It had been hit by a car. And we're cradling this thing. And I was like, I just can't take this. Because it was just like this life. I had like the plastic bag, because I'm a weirdo. I carry like gloves and plastic bags just in case. And so I'm holding it. And I was just like, babe, I can't. And so he kneels down and he picks it up and he looks up at me and he was like, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. And I was like, you love me so much. And so we were able to finish the project. So here's this, again, this is the image before with the stones. So this piece was actually commissioned by Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. And so those stones were from the Hoosick River. This dirt here is from the garlic, is it the garlic fields? The almond orchards that he and his family worked on when they first came to America. So again, like using material that holds the history, that has absorbed the history. And here's the cotton fields that they worked on as well. Cotton. And there's Michelle and Hien like pouring this beautiful pile of dirt. She's wonderful. She took so long to pour that pile. She was so careful. I was just like sitting there watching them and just look how beautiful this pile of dirt is. I love this shot because Hien is in his father's eye line. So there's like this conversation that's going on here. All the arrows are kind of like pointing toward him. Look at this pile of dirt. It's like, oh, it's so beautiful. So here's some cotton. I brought some for you to touch and on the table over there. So these beautiful blossoms. Some husbands bring home flowers. These are the blossoms that he had. He had actually had a check-in, an immigration check-in in San Francisco, and then picked these blossoms up for me on the way home. And I had never seen raw cotton. And I was like, we need more, of course. So he took me back and we harvested cotton and many other things. And I wasn't sure what to do with it yet, but I just was really enjoying the labor. I kind of wanted to live through that labor. So here I am de-seeding. One of my friends was like, why do you have to de-seed them? And I didn't even realize that I didn't have to, but I was just compelled to. And so Hien tells me this story about him working in the fields and his father. So they were so poor that they used to collect birds from these cages that the farmers would set up to trap the birds to keep them away from the crop. And Hien was like 5 or 6 years old and he wanted to help. And his mom had actually she took a rice sack and she made a drawstring bag out of the sack and they would collect all the birds. And so she lets him into the cage and he catches this bird and it's this little brown bird. And the first thing that alarmed him was the heat from its body. And then the second thing was the heartbeat. It was racing so rapidly and he let it go. And so his father walks over and was like, "Why did you let the bird go?" And here's this young boy, and he says, "Because it was afraid, and I didn't want to see it afraid." And his father, having survived the war and had seen so much bloodshed, like honored this young boy's compassion. And that story was just so endearing to me that I just needed to make a bird so I could kind of relive it. So this is my grandmother's inherited fabric, and I used these tools that I inherited from her as well, the threads. And I made this one bird. It wasn't supposed to be art. Like, I didn't see it as like making art. It was just more like creating this thing so I could live it. But it was perfect because I was like, I have this cotton. So these things start tying together when I'm really patient in the process. I feel like it might have been close to a year until I figured out what I was doing with all the cotton. Hyun tells his father that, and his father asks him, "Do you want to let the other birds go?" And Hyun said yes, and he said, "If you want to see them free, you have to be the one to free them." This is like a 5 or 6-year-old boy that's like learning these very important life lessons. And so his dad helped him open up the bag, and they let all the birds go that day. And his brothers were like, "What is happening? Like, why are you allowing Hyun to like all that work catching the birds?" But it's just such a beautiful story. So here's me just trying to fiddle around and figure out what's going on. I inherited this rice sack from my grandmother. So here they are escaping the bag. It didn't feel quite right. I wasn't sure. So I just kind of make the thing, and then I play. Play is so important. And so he surprises me one day, and he was like, "I want to take you on a tour of all the farms." All the farms? And so he takes me to this carrot factory, and it's since abandoned. Look at that amazing piece of machinery. This is where his father and his brothers worked while he was a young kid, and he would be playing out in the fields. And we find this metal crate there, just asking to be taken home. I was like, "I'm sorry, babe, I have to." That's like the most common thing you'll hear. And "I'm sorry, babe, I have to." And so I bring it home, and I have no idea what it's used for, because I was like, "That's a bell pepper carrot factory," but I feel like they go in cardboard boxes. So he confirmed that. And so I brought it home, and I really didn't know what to do with it. And I just lived with it for so long, and I'm flipping it around, and then I flip it over, and I realize that it's a cage. And so, the birds started breeding at the same time. And I just could not stop making them, and I wanted to see them all free. So I kept making them. And then I got to 80, and I was like, I think I'll start at 82. So Hyun's family arrived in 1982, so I thought it was fitting. And that might have been enough, 82. It was crazy. We were living in a shoebox of a place at the time, so it actually wrapped around the wall. We had to step around. That was at our old place. Here's another, just the light. I just love that. And again, not thinking of it as art, but just waiting for it to tell me. And so I learned, my friend Janie came over, and she saw the crate. She was like, "I have one of those." And it ended up being this crate that they used to use to hold egg cartons. So it ended up being that these those things happen all the time. It's amazing. It ended up freeing the birds. So new life, rebirth. And so I'm thinking about, as I'm working with a cotton, I'm thinking about our shared history of cotton. Here's 2 images that I have been really inspired by. This is African American Child with Parasol by Teenie Harris, who was a photojournalist out of Pittsburgh. And he worked for the Pittsburgh Courier, which was one of the first Black-run newspapers. And so this was in the 60s, I believe. 50s. And here's an image of my mom on the day of her first communion, taken during the 60s. And I just looked at just these 2 sisters from different times, different places, but they just it really spoke to me. So I am very interested, currently I'm interested in light as medium. So I superimposed them so they were standing together. They're in their Sunday's best. And I was going to project this onto, so across the street from our place is a Baptist church, and I wanted to offer it to them. So here's like a majority Black community, and then it's across the street from us, and it's in Cambodia town. And so I thought, what if we projected light literally as bridge, like projecting the light across Martin Luther King Avenue, it's amazing, onto their building. They were excited when I would speak to them, but I don't think they understood, because they kept asking, how much is it going to cost? And I'm like, nothing. And they were like, they didn't quite, they weren't very responsive. And so a lot of lessons from this, we ended up putting it on our building because they weren't responsive. And so my landlords are super cool people. And so there they are, like in the corner, looking over the church and Martin Luther King Avenue. And I was so excited about it because I had realized that these girls face the gate that they leave when they leave church. So this was the best way to offer it, not necessarily on our building, but on their building, but on our building, so that it would welcome them or see them off. And so that was like another lesson of patience. Like, we have an idea of what things should be, but really, I feel like a lot of times it's the waiting on the work and just like being faithful to the work really lends itself for the best, seemingly, the best result. Here's another image, like literally bringing light into the dark. And it's a pretty rough neighborhood that we live in. So, and just thinking about the children, the hope was that people would see the children and just kind of like be reminded, to take better care of the neighborhood. And this is the last piece. This is the mural that's at LAX. Also thinking about migration. There are 7 birds here, represented here. 5 of them represent the West. And then here's the California scrub jay, American goldfinch, the Western tanager. And then there's 2 of them that represent the East. So here's the silver-breasted broadbill, again, from Cambodia. This is a red-winged blackbird. This is Mr. Brown and Trish. Mr. Brown, he was the facilities person. I worked with him almost every day. And he walks down the hall. It's like 185 feet. So he's like walking down the hall, and he's a very quiet man, doesn't say much. And one day he was just like, how come y'all ain't got no butterflies? And I was like, we definitely need a butterfly. And so this is Mr. Brown's butterfly. And every day he'd walk in to see if I had painted the butterfly. I just fell in love with these people. I was there. It took 59 days to finish the mural, all hand painted in freehand. And it was very hard to leave them. They just shared so many stories, and they were so warm. So Hyun and I do advocacy work for families that are going through the immigration process. We didn't realize it would happen. And that's the interesting thing, is I've had so many conversations about how, like, we go through these negative situations and we don't necessarily know why. And then, like, fast forward, and we're not omniscient, so we cannot possibly perceive the why. And so when he was incarcerated, he was fighting all of these cases. He's very smart and learned from like a genius of a man. So he spent a lot of time in the law library and in the chapel. And he had fought these immigration cases for his brothers in there, mostly Vietnamese, Cambodian, there's Thai, Irish, actually. So one of the families that we're currently working with, Carlos and his family, the Espinosa family. Carlos is 23 years old, Mexican young man who's incarcerated in Santa Clara County Jail. And we just love this family so much. They're just like so beautiful, and it's just so horrible what's happening. And so here's a Mexican butterfly, and here's a Vietnamese greenfinch, and that is like our prayer for Carlos. So the prayer and the art and the life are so deeply braided together. And this is Teddy. He goes by Teddy. His name is Tedros. As I'm working on this mural, people are just coming up to me and like freely, generously sharing their stories of migration. And Tedros is from Ethiopia. And he is just such a joyous man. Like I'd hear him all the way down the hall, and every time he would greet me, my friend, like it was always my friend. And so he had come one day, and he's telling me about his story, and I was like, Ethiopia, oh my gosh, yes, Haile Selassie, your last emperor. And he was like, how do you know about this little Vietnamese woman? How do you know? And I was like, because we listen to reggae. We love reggae. So we've learned about your history. Our professor, Bob Marley, and his contemporaries. And so he brings me this bill, and it's an Ethiopian dollar that's no longer in print. So Haile Selassie was assassinated in 1975, which is the same year that Saigon fell. So that was crazy. And he brings me this bill, and there's Haile Selassie the first, and here's the Lion of Judah. And he hands me this bill, and I was like, I cannot take this. This is an artifact. And he had told me he brought 3 bills from home, and they were to give to people. And he was like, I feel like you need to have this. And so it's going to go in some work. I have plans for it, but I brought the bill, and it's in some other things for you to touch and things. So just the stories that collect, that are just like freely given. People are just so generous when it comes to art. I think it just like opens people up to, art has a way of just establishing trust with people so quickly. And that always amazes me. Like it happens all the time, but every time I'm just shocked. And this is the last slide here. This is Ang. He's from Burma, and I'd never met a Burmese person, so I was very excited about that. And I was like, what does your language look like? And he would bring me newspapers and like write in my sketchbook my name. His father had arrived in the early 2000s. Or is that right? Did I write it? Well, in 2000. And it took 12 years for his father to save up enough money to sponsor his mother. And the first job he got was at LAX. And then it took them another 12 years to sponsor he and his brother Thant. And now they're working at LAX. And it was just like such an amazing story. And they were just the most joyful people. I like smile, always joking around. Like he'd always ask to paint, so I'd put a little paint on the brush, and then he just so he could be a part of it. But yeah, I just so believe in art as service, and even if it's just to like open people up to share. So yeah, that's the last one. Thank you so much.
So good morning to all of you, and thanks to Stephanie LaRue for organizing, and thanks to the CSREA for everything it does for all us practitioners in the arts. So I want to talk a little bit today, not only about my work, but the tasks of artists and color in general, because I'm going to submit to you that we all share a slightly different dance in this large ballroom of the arts. So Pablo Picasso once said, art washes away from the soul the dust of everyday life. And certainly we are all called upon to do that. It's what I'm going to call for our purposes today, cuting. Cuting is the aesthetic contribution we all make to the conversation, that wondrous and wondering part of this that probably all got us all here in the first place. With regards to my own work, I'd say it's the very bent way that I see the world. And I think all writers, you know the joke, all writers have had terrible childhoods, right? I wouldn't call mine terrible. I would call it terribly weird. And it's translated in terms of words to a certain crisp severity of language that I use. I also, my older daughter is a visual artist, and we have oddly enough traded because I have borrowed visual concepts of negative space and diptych into my work. I use a lot of serial point of view because I think the villain is as important as the hero, and and I give them lots of depth. But artists of color in the United States are always far from what we get to do. I think is very different from what majority artists get to do in our fields. For one thing, we're neither the arbiters of funding nor the gatekeepers of canon. So people other than us are always doing the deciding and almost always making the determinations. So I think we're called upon in our push for self-determination and our quest to have a say about what kind of art survives and what kind of culture survives to accomplish 4 other C's with our art. And that's curation, collection, chronicling, and change. And in all of this, I want to give a shout out to Spike Lee because many, many years ago, when I first saw Do the Right Thing, it became a model for me on how 1 2-hour work of art could accomplish every single one of these things and blow your mind in other ways too. I always think of that movie as like there's sort of this aesthetic or artistic question about whether you are going to portray reality, whether you're going to explode reality, whether you're going to suggest that reality isn't even reality, that I think that film does so well. But so while my wordsmithing has always kind of followed grouchy old French people who weren't trying to make readers happy, my work as an artist has sort of aspired towards this do the right thing. Happy, I would call it a happiness, actually. So I'll start first with curation and collection and jump into this photo, which actually, this is such a meta story I'm going to tell because the photo itself is my mother took great pains to save this, and I mean great pains. At one point, the photo had even like ripped apart, and she took it somewhere where they did it. So these are some ancestors of mine in actually Western Kentucky. I grew up in I pretend I grew up in Eastern Kentucky. I grew up in Western Kentucky. I don't know too much about these people except, unfortunately, the woman in the middle, she died, I think, before she was even 40. She didn't know she had a heart condition. One of the men, and I don't remember which, one of them was a pianist. I am not even sure where it is, but I know my whole family is from Western Kentucky, so it's somewhere in Kentucky. So I'll talk a little bit about the curation collection as it relates to my work. So Black Appalachians, as you may or may not know, are having a moment. And if you don't know, it may be a smaller moment than I think it is. But this is mostly thanks to former Kentucky Poet Laureate Crystal Wilkinson, whose praise song for the Kitchen Ghosts is making some very serious rounds. But also thanks to those who came before her. People like Frank X. Walker, who founded the Affrilachian Poets, and literary giant Gail Jones, who wrote of the experiences of Black Kentuckians. It's funny. When I talk about Kentucky, I feel my accent changing back, so just forgive it. I know you heard it, right? The minute I get off the plane, I'm like, okay. This moment of celebration of Black Kentucky and West Virginia poets and writers like Crystal, Lisa Cross Smith, and Stephen Dunn is a long time coming. We've always been here. So who are we? We're the people who turned all this stony soil into tobacco. We're the people who live in the whitest states south of the Mason-Dixon line. We are the Black people in the diaspora who don't season our food, which has made me the butt of many jokes. People come to my house, they're like, what is this? I'm like, okay. So we use 30 kinds of sugar and we pour bourbon in everything, but we do not season our food. We are the Black people who call a washcloth a wash rag, and we otherwise talk funny. And so this is a little aside that a lot of people don't know that we're really proud of. So it turns out, like, if you run a comparison, if you run sort of this auditory comparison, our version of English is actually closest to what was originally spoken, because the people who lived in the Deep South needed to distinguish themselves from us, so they created this whole other accent. So we take great pride in that. Anyway, Black Appalachians are a people who, as part of the census, are rapidly disappearing. As you know, we just become a smaller part of the United States census numbers, and particularly in Appalachia, as young Black people leave the mountains and hollers. So when I first wrote my first novel, I was acutely aware of this, that my culture was rapidly vanishing, and I wanted to write it a love letter. So I wrote St. Monkey as that love letter to a time and place my parents and grandparents knew. And St. Monkey takes place in the late 50s. And it takes place in the part of Eastern Kentucky that there were. So when some of you may know this, the first jockeys in the Kentucky Derby, which is Sunday, by the way, the first jockeys who won it were Black, and all of the people who cared for the horses were Black. So there used to be a whole ring of horse farms around Lexington that were these small Black communities. Now they're kind of like, their church might be left, but everybody lives in Lexington, or they've moved to points beyond, you know. So I wanted to write about that place. And one really pleasurable part of it for me was that because I do write in diptych, one of the voices was a young girl who, the story is about, it's about two girls who are best friends. One of the girls' father killed her mother, stuffs her in the stovepipe of their house. And when they find her and they haul him off to prison, she's left raising her sister. So she has a very distinct way of speaking, which translated into the writing. And what I had to do was I had to make a chart of all the various verb tenses. Like, do y'all know the difference between weren't and weren't? When you use weren't and when you use were are two very different occasions, right? I also had a vocabulary list, because do y'all know what a swarp is? A swarp is a swarm of bees, sorry. But there was all these words like that have just kind of disappeared, like cairn, from English, you know. And so I wanted to kind of chronicle that as well. So it's the same urge towards curation and collection that is basically in this photo itself. And I think that this photo speaks to an us that the wider world didn't even believe existed until recently, and it's in part because of literature. So when Crystal and I are friends, when she first started sending out stories and novels, this is about 20 years ago, she had publishers and agents who told her no one would even believe there were Black people who lived in Kentucky. Nobody would want to read about it. And in fact, I think, like, since Gail Jones, she's kind of the first person who's published widely about Black Appalachians. So it's that task of recording that I set about with in St. Monkey. My second and third novels are kind of different. And they were more about the last two C's I mentioned, chronicling and making change. So for my third novel, and I wish I had these photos. I could not find them, but I want you guys to imagine this. Okay, so my second novel, this is Mother Country, it takes place partially in Mauritania, which, and anybody ever been or Do you know anything? So Mauritania, there's a reason nobody's been, right? It is, most of it is the Sahara, and it is really hard to get there. It's really hard to get a visa. You have to lie, basically. Once you get there, it is like you step back into time like 500 years, right? So I went in 2013. There was one ATM in the whole country. It wasn't working. I had to have my dad wire me money, and when he wired the money, I had to be escorted by a man to the bank. I had to wear full hijab. It's a lot. Okay, and so you can imagine that, well, in reality, 20% of the population of that country is enslaved. And it is brutal. It is as brutal as any slavery you've ever heard of in the history of slavery, right? Escaping is almost impossible. Escaping is almost impossible because of the landscape. So while I was there, I was doing work for Al Jazeera, actually. I was introduced to a family of escaped slaves, and this woman had 8 kids. And all the kids were different colors because her master had leased her out as a prostitute. The last kid, I get like weepy talking about this, but the last kid was the one who was born on her way out of the desert. And it was kind of, thank you. This was for you, and now it's for me. Thank you. It was like so I held this baby. The baby was asleep. She was so happy to give her a break. Let me give her a break. I was holding this baby, and it was like the most powerful feeling because it was the feeling of everyone in history whose ancestors has escaped slavery, and that first person who was born free. It was so powerful. So she's sitting there with all these kids, and it's like, it's 120 degrees. This woman, she's like living in a tent in the capital city. And I was like, what can I do for you? She was like, they're translators. She was like, just tell my story, tell my story. So for the second one, I felt really, I wrote this article for Al Jazeera. I ended up writing it, and it was, in contrast, quite boring. It was about women in development. But the real story to me was that woman and all the composite stories of slavery that are still happening in Mauritania. They didn't outlaw it till 2008, and it never gets prosecuted, right? So, the second novel was kind of more about that urge, and then let me talk a little bit. I'll bundle these together. My third novel, and this one's coming out next year. It's called Trigger Warning. And the kind of plot of that one is that this woman, her father is killed by the police in the late 80s. She, in response to that, changes her name and moves to Kentucky, changes her whole identity, makes up a whole story. And then when the novel opens, she's getting divorced, and she's getting divorced under her real name. And her husband's like, what? Who are you? So the whole novel kind of follows her. She takes her kid and just drives off to California to try to like reclaim her past. So that came out of this article, which, this was a hard one because I talked to the mothers of people who had been killed by the police, and they're all, it's hard to forget any of these people, any of their stories. 2 things stuck out to me, though, as things that people don't often think about when we think about police brutality. One is that I think we always think of the victim and this terrible thing they went through. You know what I mean? There's a dude in Sacramento, I found out when I was writing this, he was held on the pavement until he suffered third-degree burns all over his body because it's like a very hot day in Sacramento. And I mean, he's for life, disabled now. So there are all these people who are either killed or maimed. But then there's the family story. So like one thing Tamir Rice's mom told me is that for a long time, his sister, who witnessed the murder, couldn't eat. And she just kind of became anorexic and lost all this, there are three other kids in that family. Their academic sort of performance just declined. I mean, that was kind of the least of it. They just will never be the same, And all of these people said that. But the other thing that caught my attention is how many of them said that during the trial or shortly after the killing happened, they were then terrorized by the police. This woman in Sacramento told me that the police would just come and sit in front of her house, and during the trial, there would be more than one car just sitting there, So I thought, people rarely consider that because it is state-sponsored terror, it has to also then affect the whole community, right? So it's beyond this victim and this family. So that's kind of what my third novel was about. And it's interesting because the evolution from sort of like chronicling and curating and collecting to chronicling as a way of making change is a little tricky because the American literary aesthetic is so apolitical, and so I have, that's one reason I kind of have always written in diptych, so that it's kind of my answer to the question of like how do we lend so much depth to the villainry that we understand that it is systematic and we're all even participating in it. So that's kind of why I write in diptych. And then this is a funny, my last photo. I'll tell you about the novel that I'm working on now. And this is, so I have to tell you the funny story behind this photo, which is that one really weird thing about me is that I have served on 2 different school boards in 2 different states, wholly by accident both times. This photo is from when I was elected president of the school board in Ann Arbor, completely by accident. And it was like, do you remember when Trump was elected and he had this look on his face like, oh no. So that's me. That's me. Not even knowing half of but they had just run this video. They were like, they passed this like $1 billion construction bond, and they talked about the budget and how many employees, and then they swore me in, and I was like, really? So, while I was on, both school boards actually, but especially in Michigan, which, as you may or may not know, has their K-12 system is in some serious crisis, So I learned a lot about, so much. But one thing I learned is that schools are becoming more and more resegregated. School integration actually peaked in 1987. It is now at Brown versus Board of Ed levels. You are statistically more likely now, if you are a Black or Latino kid, to attend a school that is at least 75% students of color than you were like even 10 years ago. If you're white, you're something like, I think 48% of white kids go to schools that are 75 or more percent white. So we're back where we were. And the thing is now it's, we have, now that we are prevented from talking about race or classing people by race, you have to do everything around socioeconomic status, and people are beginning to even oppose that. So things like school mergers or redistricting are like hot items now. And so like when I ran for school board in Michigan, the year I ran, Turning Point USA had put $20 million into school board races because post-COVID, they have decided this is where conservatives are now kind of, this is their testing ground, if you will, for like anti-CRT measures, book banning, So the novel I'm working on now kind of grew out of this because Whew, it's a lot, and this is probably the hardest novel that I have written so far. I keep turning away from it and coming back and turning away because I don't know that people understand the way this is informing everything, the way that school segregation informs residential segregation, which informs environmental injustice, which, just on and on and on and on and on. So it's turned into this massive project. But yeah, it's also kind of about the sort of premise of this fourth one is that this man is terminally ill, and he meets a bunch of activists at a train terminal. So the title is Terminal, and there's some magical realism. And what else, the only other thing I can tell you, because I can never talk about them until I'm finished, but the only other thing I can tell you that's kind of fascinating is that the magical realism involves fungus. So I'm going next week to see the biggest. There's some fungus in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that is the largest living organism in North America. It is 4,000 years old. Fungus is kind of fascinating. It talks to itself, like, in a patch, because this patch is as big as the Mall of America. And so it's this whole like system underground. So that's me and my weird work. So nice to meet you all.